50–60% of their business will be predicated on securing local contract with small schools or the local VEC or their local secondary school, etc. The industry as a whole would employ about 3,000 people nationally. But we don't want to restrict it purely to copier suppliers. For every batch of 3,000 people involved in copier supplies, there's 3,000 people in stationery and ICT consumables. So, I mean, it's tens of thousands of jobs are at risk. Tens of thousands.
Deputy Kine.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to welcome the groups here today, and I appreciate the sincerity and the concern that you have expressed. I suppose a number of groups would have contacted me, particularly art suppliers through schools. I don't think I represent Galway West, so I don't think I was contacted regarding this particular your particular concerns. That's not to say that obviously that you weren't engaged with other people regarding them. I raised an issue with Minister Howland in the Dáil last June, and the question in relation to the setting up of the Office of Public Procurement and the measures taken to maximise the participation in the procurement process of SMEs. And there was a number of points he raised, and I just maybe I should to comment on them. He talked about Circular 10, which I'm sure you're aware of 2014, launched in April, setting out the new initiatives regarding procurement, the new guidelines aimed at reducing the burden of costs. And he said the SME working group, which, as you know, includes ISME, IBEC, the small firms, chambers, and the Department of Jobs. And he said that the new circular has been broadly welcomed by the industry representatives. When I went on to question him regarding the savings and all of that, he stated less than 5% of the overall public procurement spend is now won by foreign companies. In excess of 95% of public procurement in Ireland is won by Irish companies, 75% of which are SMEs, and that was the figure for 2013, up from 60% in 2012. He said, whatever we're doing, we're moving in the right direction. So that's at odds with what you're saying, and I appreciate you have real examples of real job losses and the effect on your industry. You know, if that's the overall scene, and if that's the figures he has, I just wondering, like, you could, if those are the figures that are real, and presumably he has them on the Dáil record. He's saying, well, that's good. We're moving in the right direction. This is fine. So, just wondering, could you comment on those figures?
Mr. O'Reilly.
The figures that were given to you are at odds with the figures that were given to us at the high-level group of small business regulation from the Office of Government Procurement. They said that the figure was 15%, but they qualified it by saying 15% of was lost to the island of Ireland. One of the members at the meeting went berserk. He said, when did we annex the north? And he asked, what is the figure for the state? And the figure for the state was 27%. So the Office of Government Procurement are saying 27%. And Minister Howland is saying something different. So somebody is wrong. I don't know who's wrong. The next thing I'd say to you is, that's a lovely circular that was brought out 1010, with the replacement for 1010. But he forgot to mention that they also published a circular called Circular 1613, which basically threatens public sector bodies that if they don't comply, they face an audit from the Controller and Auditor General. Now, any public sector body out there with people in there don't want to draw this down on top of them and make a decision. It's easier to go with it. So you have two circulars, one saying all the right things, which he can show to you, and one saying the opposite, which is applied to us. So, like, we must have consistency. If you are going to publish two circulars, tell everybody about it, because public sector bodies, people are doing their job. They don't want to be drawing trouble down on top of themselves. And the most ironic thing about the whole lot of it is that when the office, or when the Controller and Auditor General went to get a managed print service, they decided not to use the framework produced by the Office of Government Procurement. Now, doesn't that speak volumes? The people who are policing it say it is bad, but everybody else is forced to use it.
Thank you, Mr.
If I may reply.
Mr. Bannigan.
Just in reply to Circular 1014 that came out this year, one of the issues, and this is even brought up in Chambers Ireland, the library contract that was issued this year, issued after that circular, completely ignored Circular 1014. And that was one of the issues brought up by Chambers Ireland in a press statement in relation to that contract. They said that while it was a very welcome document, was just being completely ignored.
Deputy Kine, did you want to come back in again?
Yeah, I do, but maybe.
You've been quoting statistics, okay?
I've been quoting the figures given to me in the Dáil by the Minister.
Okay. If I can give some examples of where projected figures and actual outcomes varied significantly, okay? There was one specific tender we were involved in where the overall value of the contract was deemed to be €100 million over a 2-year period. And it was that value of the contract that then determined what the pre-qualification criteria would be to actually have the right to tender in the first place. The actual value of the contract over 2 years was 16 million. So the point I'm making is, without having the matrices in place to be able to arrive at these various statistics that are accurate in any way, I kind of smile inwardly when I hear someone quoting me statistics in that manner. That's the first point. Secondly, in relation to the second circular that you mentioned, David, 1613, it's paying lip service. I mean, it's a smiley, happy face projecting our concern for small and medium enterprise. But at the end of the day, it made constant reference to the creation of consortia that, based on the advice we've been given, you cannot legally undertake. Like I said, the representative from the Competitions Authority that's written into the minutes of a previous JEI committee clearly stated if you want to respond to these consortia, buy someone, merge with someone or be bought. But don't talk to someone else about it. There are two separate entities because you're breaking the law.
Deputy
Yeah,
Kine.
thanks for that. I'll certainly raise, I mean, obviously the Chief Procurement Officer is coming in after this. I'll certainly raise these with him. The figures are given to me. Just, Mr. Riley, you mentioned 27%. What exactly 27%?
27% of the government contracts left the state.
Contracts left the state.
Yes,
As
and
opposed
I'm not mentioning names. I met. Sorry.
Is that by value of the contract or is it by number? By value.
Well, he said the gentleman will be coming in a minute. I met him outside. I was surprised they're not here at the same time. He said 27% of the contracts left the state, but that was only after being pushed. Originally, it was 15%, and they had this thing in it about on the island of Ireland, but actually in the state was 27%.
Mr. McNamee.
From Tender Scout annual report for 2013, who are a company who assist SMEs to be able to tender for government procurement, and their figure is that 28% of public tender left the state, and that's widely in the public arena, and is quoted by Dr. Paul Davis as well, who's here later on today. So I think, there's two figures which are close to 30%.
And from your figures, how has that changed vis-a-vis 2013, 2012, 2011?
It's a huge increase.
Huge increase in left
Yeah.
the state. Well, it's totally at odds to what the Minister had told me in the Dáil when I questioned him. He said 95%, in excess of 95% of public procurement in Ireland is won by Irish companies, 75% of which are SMEs. So is there, well, certainly we'll have to put this to the Chief Procurement Officer, because I presume the Minister has gotten his figures from the Procurement Officer, I'd imagine. That's where they would get the figures, get them from a state
I
agency.
want to move on to Deputy Lawler now, if you have something.
Just one last point. There's an EU-produced document from 2010, and it actually cites Ireland in the same company as Malta, at that time, as exporting up to 15%, 14 to 15% in 2010. And we were in the same league as Malta in terms of exporting our procurement. And it has got a lot worse since then because of this policy.
Okay, Mr. Ryan.
Are government ministers legally obliged to tell the truth in the Dáil?
Deputy Lawler.
I suppose this is a bugbear of mine for a long number of years, and there's 8.5 billion of government funding, or not funding, but procurement on an annual basis. And obviously, from my perspective, would be to try to keep virtually all this money within the state itself. And I've had many rows with the previous Minister Hayes on this whole issue. And can I just ask a couple of questions?
Can somebody check the phone? I hear interference. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you, Deputy Lawler. Continue.
That's all right.
Sabotage.
Yes, it wouldn't be the first time Sinn Féin sabotaged me.
Not the last.
Just on a couple of, most of the stuff is done through e-tenders, and I've looked at the e-tender document. Your own viewpoint with regard to how simple e-tender documents, if you are able to pre-qualify for it, are, because I found them very confusing. So I just want to, and if we need to work on that, I'm looking at an overall thing. Secondly, with regard to the centralisation and the aggregation, as you've mentioned too before, can you give me, just in regard to what you see as the opposite to that, and how you can justify the opposite of centralisation as being reducing the cost? Because obviously the whole purpose of the centralisation was to reduce the cost, but there is this social cost too as well. Can you just comment on that too as well? What do you mean by a level playing field? John, you mentioned that, right? And what do you see as a, you've used the word an opportunity to quote. How can we adjust the policy at the moment to make sure that all SMEs are allowed quote? I must say, the figures you put out there is something we've been harping on here for a long time with regard to how you identify SMEs. You know, and you're dead right. 95% of companies have less than 10 people, and to exclude 95% of companies from the ability to get a slice of this 8.5 billion is, in my opinion, wrong. But just on those figures that you've given us there, how can you get that message out stronger? Because it's not been picked up by national media or by the government, the minister himself, with regard to the importance of those between 0 to 10. We brought a booklet last week for entrepreneurs, and most of them are starting companies of 0 to 10. And when you listen to the minister, those companies in the first 5 years will be generating 2 out of every 3 jobs in the country. So, how can you get this message across? I'm not referring about the court case, and that hasn't been highlighted either in the media. It's been very thing. And the last point is just, I suppose, and it might be from, I have to think about the way I'm going to word this. In your opinion, the reason why just the OPW may have brought it to the Supreme Court.
That's, I'm afraid.
Okay, right. Okay.
You didn't word it carefully enough.
I am
Deputy.
thinking of how to word it, right?
We'll give you a minute so while we get some
Right,
answers. Mr. O'Brien, did you signal to come in there first?
Sure. In relation to level playing pitch, it's very simple, Anthony. Let us have an opportunity to at least quote for the business. Because at the moment, let's take the management services tender that was issued. The request for tender was a 48-page document. On page 2, paragraph 4, I can picture it. It said in big bold writing, you need not reply to this tender, because there was a pre-qualification criteria that, in my opinion, was inflated to a point that it excluded me from the process. Now, this was a request for tender that didn't ask any successful tenderer to show the value they can provide. They simply had to pre-qualify.
And I don't want to get into the pre-qualification is an issue that's come up with regard to turnover, insurance capacity. Like you're saying that is set at a level that excludes.
Well, let's follow it through. And again, I don't want to make any reference to other kind of court cases going through or whatever. But that was a management services tender that made reference to turnover 100 million. The value of the contract, you needed a minimum turnover of 10 million a year. Okay. A request for tender was issued following from that broke the market down into 5 separate lots that David has made reference to. And just as it happens, each lot had a minimum turnover requirement of €2 million per lot to pre-qualify.
Specifically about a case you cannot.
Now, this is in relation to a specific tender. So I'm invoking what was in part of a tender process.
But is that part of a case at the moment?
That is being challenged,
Well,
yes.
then we can't discuss it.
Okay, well, it's hard
It's
for
for
me to
your
respond to you.
protection and it's for the protection of the members as well. Mr. Riley?
You asked how we could get away from this aggregation and still show value for money. Now, you have a number of areas. If Cork County Council are purchasing equipment, they go out to tender in their local area, and everybody will compete. If you allow aggregation, it's only the people who pre-qualify, and in certain situations it's 5 or 7. So only 4 of them might be interested in that. So it's only 4 people competing instead of having 24 people competing for the business. You have, in recent contracts, you have a case where they've done a central purchase, but they failed to do due diligence on existing equipment that was within that department. At this present second, there are machines in councils that there's 4 years left to run on leases, that they have purchased centrally, another batch of machines, and they're now trying to negotiate their way out of the first set of leases. They had existing contracts. And they can say to you here, when they come in, yes, look, we show you better value for money. But they forget this, like the circular, the second circular a while ago, 1613. They forget to tell you about that, what's actually going on. They forget to tell you also that in the stationery contract, the last one that was awarded, they had 250 core items. And they were at ridiculously low prices. And they were of ridiculously low quality. And if you stepped 1 inch off that €250 contract, or 250 core items, you paid through the nose for the items you bought. If the lever arch file was black, it was at an extremely good price. If it was blue, you paid 6 times more. They made a fortune out of it. There was a company in the UK that didn't get the contract, and they were referring to this country as Treasure Island. Because they
Senator
couldn't make some.
Senator Quinn, have you a question, Senator Quinn?
I came in here today reminded myself of an experience we had in Superquin, where our central buying took place for all the goods for resale. But we didn't have central buying for all the other little things like first aid and other things that went around on desks. We decided to centralise that. And I couldn't get over the huge difference in price there was. Now, we had 22 branches, and the difference in price between when we centralised the purchasing as against buying locally from people, and our own manager said, but they give us great service. But there was a gap of something like 72%. It's a huge amount we were having to pay. So I can understand the minister and the government saying, we've got to do something to make sure procurement is taken under some sort of a rational wing. Now, the points you've made here today, I think the onus is on you to do something about it. You've taken the instance of Scotland. Who was it talked about Scotland? And I thought that was fascinating to hear that they said it isn't just price, it's other things as well. You said something about a 60-mile or 60-kilometre gap. You mentioned Northern Ireland, how the gap that occurred, that they have a different policy as well. They take into account other things. I think you've a job to do, and you've done it today. We've a job to do as well, and that is to to sell to the people of Ireland that it isn't just price. There are other benefits as well. You mentioned it very well here today. I think it's the first step. I hope it's not the first step. I hope it's a long way along the line of being able to make your case and win that case.
Senator Quinn. Ms. Fallon?
Yeah, Senator Quinn, that's very difficult when a tender comes up for a procurement thing comes up for tender and it goes 100% on price and it goes to Britain. This happened to one of the tenders here last Christmas. It went to Britain. Britain got it, decided it wouldn't do a part of this tender. That went in the bin.
Business gone.
Business gone.
Mr.
Business
McNeil, did you want
gone.
to come in there?
Well, the business was gone in the sense that it couldn't be invoiced in the same way that Irish companies had been invoicing and servicing the books. So there was 70,000 lost through the prison service for procurement of books, and the money was gone then because it was gone into the next budgetary session.
Thank you. Mr. Brannigan, I'll have to give you the final word because we have another session to commence in a few minutes. So,
Okay. Well, just on the value for money, just to give you a concrete example, like in 2012, the library contract went to the UK, and by my estimate, the winning tender was 6%, maybe 6%. I'm not sure exactly, but no more than that, cheaper than me, right? And all those jobs went to the UK for about 5%. We're not talking about double-digit figures even here. So all those jobs were lost for a small percentage figure. And that's a real example. And I think, you know, where we're talking about Scottish procurement, there's a procurement duty, and I think this is what we need to bring in here as a solution. You're looking for a solution. There's a duty on the procurement officer in Scotland to demonstrate a benefit to the local community. And you can see it in construction contracts and everything else in Scotland now. We need to bring that in here. And it's legal and it's in law.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bannigan. So I'd like to thank you all for coming in here today to engage with the committee. We sincerely appreciate it. It's been a tremendous help to us. It certainly has been very clear the difficulties that you're experiencing, and I really appreciate you taking the opportunity to come in to share that with us, and it'll certainly help inform the report that we will produce afterwards, of which you'll all have access to, and no doubt we'll be getting individual copies. So we'll suspend for 1 minute now to allow yourselves to withdraw and for the extra witnesses to come in. Thank you. Session, I would remind members and those in the public gallery to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off for the duration of this meeting, as they interfere with the broadcasting equipment even when on silent mode. Now we're moving to the further discussion in respect of access to public procurement contracts and related matters for small suppliers, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Davis, Business Department, DCU, Aidan Sweeney and Fergal O'Brien, IBEC, Paul Quinn and Vincent Campbell, Office of Government Procurement, to discuss issues for small suppliers in respect of access to public procurement contracts and related matters. In accordance with procedure, I'm required to read the following. By virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or entity by name or in any such way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now ask Dr. Paul Davis to make his presentation to the committee. I will then call on Mr. Sweeney, followed by Mr. Paul Quinn. So I've called on Dr. Paul Davis.
Thank you. Procurement within the public sector is often seen as a very traditional tendering role, and in terms of the set of activities that are in place within it, it can significantly contribute more than just the tender itself. It's a wider process. What we see currently in the public sector is a lack of the use of that full range of the procurement process. In many cases of procurement in the public sector, engagement with suppliers either through pre-market engagement or through ongoing contract evaluation does not take place. The Irish public sector itself over the last 3 to 4 years has formally moved to a more centralised approach for procurement, and yet research throughout both Europe and abroad has shown that centralised state procurement can lead to a stifling of innovation and a reduction in competition, and it certainly does not allow for local needs or increased participation of SMEs. The general approach of Irish public procurement is to deal with the tactical issues of price and delivery and really to forgo the investment in strategic activities. And certainly there is some evidence of crossover between the job strategy and public procurement, but in other areas we're not seeing as much crossover on policy into public procurement as we should see. In a recent review carried out for Enterprise Ireland, I noted that there has been no follow-up to policy implementation from 2009 where we had procurement of innovation, in terms of there were no key performance indicators put in place once that policy was in. There was no monitoring of that policy over a 5-year period, and now some 5 years later we have had no results of positive impact or negative impact that we could measure coming out of that policy being implemented. And that is consistent with public procurement policy that we see. In the Programme for Public Sector Reform, published in January 2014, there is less than 1 paragraph out of 4 pages of text on public procurement that refers to SME participation. 1 paragraph. And in that paragraph, it states that the Office of Government Procurement will only address policy 1 area in SME, and to date, that seems to have been Circular 1014, with very little evidence being shown that other policies will be addressed. So it looks like the OGP has succeeded in ticking the box for policy implementation on a procurement plan that runs over 2 years. The following are the recommendations that I would have made both to Enterprise Ireland and over a number of years to people. All future policies aimed at suppliers should be mindful of the significant differences that exist within the SME sector. In a survey carried out over 3 years for the OGP and for the National Procurement Service that's been carried out by DCU, 50% of companies competing for public sector contracts are micro-enterprises. They do not form a part of any policy that we've seen to date. We seem to state very clearly small to medium-sized enterprises, but not to deal with micro-enterprises. And these are enterprises that deal with 1 to 9 employees. Clear KPIs for SME participation should be set for all public procurers. To date, we don't have any key performance indicators that are used throughout any public sector body that states what level of participation is in place for SMEs or what level of participation should be in place for SMEs. And even if they were put in place, we don't have any contract monitoring to ensure that they have been put in place. Clarity needs to be provided from a government perspective as to what is exactly the intended outcome of a policy where public procurement is being put in place. It's not clear always how public procurement will support policy objectives, and that should be upfront. The OGP certainly should set out clear rules and roles outlining how collaborations might occur. I understand that there has been some progress made in this area with the Competition Authority, but there are still question marks over how small companies can form consortia and can bid in. Training on the issues surrounding consortia building should also be dealt with. And certainly, procurers should be required to set targets related to market intelligence and to gathering at the outset of each procurement the size of the market, the level of participation by micro-enterprises, and what needs to be done. Thank you. Thank you.
Are you finished?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And now we move on to Mr. Sweeney.
Yes. Okay, here, look,
Is it Mr. O'Brien that's doing it?
Mr. O'Brien just introduced.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much to the committee for the invitation. Just a brief word of introduction. I'm going to ask my colleague Aidan Sweeney, who's IBEX specialist in this area, to talk through some of the detailed content. Just a word of introduction from an IBEC perspective. Some of the committee members will be aware that we have 7,500 members in business right across all sectors of the Irish economy. Within IBEC, we have about 60 trade associations, many of which would have a keen interest in the area of public procurement. The issues of small business and SMEs are addressed extensively across the IBEC network. In particular, the Small Firms Association is part of the IBEC family as well. So from an IBEC perspective, there's a broad range of interests here in terms of our direct membership interests across procurement as a very significant sector of the Irish economy from a public procurement perspective. In terms of our broader policy agenda, our priorities to government in terms of public policy at the moment would include supporting investment in our economy, and public procurement is an important dimension of that, supporting public sector efficiency and driving better government. So we have a very strong agenda in terms of the need for efficiency in public expenditure, around supporting entrepreneurship, startups and innovation, and again we see public procurement as being a significant factor in that policy domain. And a final significant policy issue for us is around helping our members to be successful in export markets. And again, we see public procurement as being a very significant factor in terms of helping companies to find business opportunities internationally. So just to give you that context in terms of a very broad range of policy issues from IBEC in the general field of public procurement, I might ask then my colleague Aidan Sweeney to talk to some of the detail. Aidan leads our better government and in particular our public procurement agenda.
Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you. First of all, what I would just like to pick up on a point that Dr. Davis mentioned about this is that, particularly when we're talking about small businesses, is to emphasise that what we're really talking about is small and micro enterprises. And it's often confused when you look at the procurement directives that their definition of an SME is a large company in an Irish context. So we just need to be aware of that. And also, I joined IBEC about 6.5, 7 years ago, and what we've seen is a tremendous amount of change in the public procurement system in Ireland. Not all positive. There's been obviously a lot of the economic downturn and the impact that's had, particularly say on the capital expenditure side, and the rapid sort of reduction in the number of projects. That's had an impact on the marketplace, so we just need to be conscious of that as well. As well as the fact is that there was a big emphasis was actually on unilateral cuts. So there were a number of circulars. There was a circular back in 0209 that implemented an 8% cut that particularly harmed some small indigenous software companies in particular. That was issued. So there was a lot of unilateral cuts, and procurement was seen as a sort of a soft target. And then this was coupled at the time where we actually looked at, first with the establishment of the National Procurement Service, and now today with the Office of Government Procurement, is looking at greater centralisation and aggregation of contracts and the drive for efficiencies through that. Now, we would see that this is supposedly moving from the battle over price, which is a major constraint on, barrier for SMEs in bidding in, to value for money. But we would like to see that a lot of the efficiencies are actually on the administrative and burden side rather than actually on the access for SMEs to win those contracts. So there's a big concern for SMEs in terms of a lack of a level playing field, the removal of local buying knowledge, be it through their existing, a lot of our companies are concerned who already have public contracts, and now that they're going to potentially see their markets and their contact points changing to companies that are looking to bid in for the first time. So we would see that it is very important that the Office of Government Procurement, the category councils that are under their jurisdiction, as well as the sector leads across health, education, justice and defence, that they would actually establish more of an ongoing practical engagement with SMEs to what they're going to buy, who they're going to buy it from, the terms and conditions that they're looking for, the more dedicated, specific meet the buyer events. But we'd also like to see that someone on the category council is responsible for the SME community within those areas, so that they can actually look at why SMEs that are traditionally selling in may not be no longer able to win contracts, and if so, address that point. We'd also like to see that IBEC was involved with the Office of Government Procurement on the SME Procurement Working Group, that we've seen the work on Circular 1014 published earlier this year on improving SME access to public sector markets. The key thing for us is to see that actually fully implemented right across the public sector. That's a start, and we would see that as a start. There's a lot more that we can do to improve the market, and through encouraging sort of innovation and buying, take up from some of our new starters, relatively newer companies, as well as actually looking at procurement as an export market. References in Ireland are actually very, very important for them to secure international contracts through the public sector markets, because we remember it's a regulated market and the rules apply across Europe. What we would also like to see is that in terms of using the administrative concerns is greater use of e-procurement and technology to reduce a lot of the costs and the paperwork and the constraints. And we would like to see that the Irish government will produce an e-government strategy or e-procurement strategy. The last such e-procurement strategy was developed back in 2001. I would like to see one that just goes beyond what's set out in the e-procurement directives, in line with the National Payments Plan, to allow full submissions and actually payment through the actual e-procurement process. Again, we would like to see an improvement to the standardised terms and conditions available, so that companies are actually familiar with the documentation available and know how they're applied and the criteria used. We've seen evidence of, at the time, where we've seen actually different terms and conditions being asked for or sought that may not be relevant to the actual conduct of that contract. What we'd also like to see is that more consistency around the indemnity liability provisions, because that's a barrier. A lot of companies, once they see them, will actually just walk away from bidding. So that actually addressing such concerns as this would actually create better efficiencies that will benefit ultimately the taxpayers. We would also like to see a provision around the framework contracts, and particularly with the use of the category councils, a comply or explain principle to the use of lots and how they're divided, and how that strategy, they should be able to explain, why they don't opt to divide a contract into lots, not look at it across different categories, but maybe look at it across regions. That will actually bring in more sort of localized SMEs as well into the process. Finally, we'd also like to see that a lot of buyers and the category councils would produce both annual and multi-annual procurement plans. This will actually help inform the market and SMEs to actually look at what strategies they should take place to actually position themselves to bid for contracts. This would help actually form consortia. The publication, as Dr. Davis said, by the Competition Authority of new guidelines to help SMEs form consortia are going to be key to this, but so will training, and we'll need to make sure that the development agencies would actually have adequate supports available to help SMEs and companies and their client bases to actually seek training. Thank you.
I now go to Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the committee for their invitation to attend the meeting today. I'd like to introduce my colleague Vincent Campbell, who is OGP's Policy Director as well. The paper circulated in advance will give the committee an understanding of the fundamental changes taking place within public procurement. I understand I have about 5 minutes to make remarks here, and so don't intend to go through that paper in detail. I want to highlight some of the areas where I believe may be of interest to the committee. I think it's important to note from the outset that the new structures for procurement are still at a very early stage. As Chief Procurement Officer, I welcome the debate here and the advice and guidance that committees such as this can provide as we start to make significant changes to how procurement is done in the state. The Procurement Reform Programme is an element of the government's overall reform programme and is tasked with delivering increased value for money, more accurate and timely data, and improvement in the capacity and capability of procurement across the public service. The state spends significant amounts on goods and services, with an estimated spend in 2014 of 8.5 billion, of which 5.8 billion is addressable by procurement. A new model for procurement was approved by government in 2012, with common goods and services to be procured by a new central sourcing organisation, the Office of Government Procurement, or OGP, and with central sourcing organisations in health, education, local government and defence, procuring the sectoral specific goods and services. In January 2013, I took up my role as the state's first Chief Procurement Officer. In consultation with the key sectors, I developed a high-level implementation plan for the new model, and this plan was approved by government in April 2013. In addition to its operational procurement role, the OGP also provides the national policy function, customer support services, and systems for all the sourcing organisations, including electronic tendering systems, business intelligence, and electronic catalogues. The new structural arrangements for the OGP and the sectoral sourcing organisations are currently going into place. Staff are being recruited into the OGP from across the public service, thereby concentrating and leveraging the public sector's procurement expertise. Similar processes are taking place in local government, education and health to create the centralised sourcing organisations in those sectors. Transition arrangements are being planned across sourcing organisations to realign responsibilities. The main changes will happen late this year and early into 2015. The new model is underpinned by a common governance model that brings together the new sourcing organisations to cooperate and collaborate. The arrangements include a procurement executive, a steering group to oversee the transition to the new model, and an interim board chaired by the Minister of State, Mr. Simon Harris, to provide strategic advice to the OGP and to the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform on procurement matters. Accountability for sourcing rests with the sourcing organisation that undertakes the tendering. The OGP does not have the resources or mandate to oversee or audit the actions of these other sourcing organisations. The OGP relies upon the governance arrangements in place for those public bodies, including the offices of the Controller and Auditor General and the Local Government Audit Service, to provide such assurances. Budget responsibility remains with the public service bodies. The contractual elements put in place by the new sourcing organisations helps those bodies remain compliant and to deliver value for money. Any savings that arises from procurement remain with those bodies, enabling them to remain within their budgets, to deal with increased demand or deliver new projects and services. In the area of policy, public procurement has strong rules and regulations determined by the EU Treaty and directives and by national laws. The key principles enshrined in the treaty are openness, transparency, equitable treatment and non-discrimination. This means that tendering must be conducted in a way that provides equal treatment to bidders, whether they're big or small, whether they're based in Berlin or Bantry, or are a new or well-established business. The OGP is fully aware of the significant role that SMEs play in the Irish economy and is strongly committed to ensuring that SMEs are fully engaged in public sector procurement and the opportunities presenting. In that context, the OGP has established a high-level group on SME access in conjunction with the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, Enterprise Ireland and Intertrade Ireland. The group is focused on monitoring the delivery of the procurement commitments under the Action Plan for Job. jobs and to develop further strategies to improve SME access to procurement. In addition, the OGP Policy Director, Vincent on my right, chairs the SME Working Group, which brings together the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, Enterprise Ireland, the Competition Authority and Intertrade Ireland, with industry representative bodies including IBEC, Small Firms Association, CIF, Chambers Ireland and ISME. On 17th of April of this year, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform issued new guidance to public procurers regarding SME access in the form of Circular 1014. The guidance sets out that procurers should conduct market analysis in order to ensure that they understand the markets they are addressing. This analysis will advise their strategies and actions in order to ensure that they maintain competition in the market. The guidance also encourages procurers to break larger tenders into lots, which can enable smaller businesses and SMEs to compete for tenders. It reduces the recommended thresholds for turnover to 2 times contract value and sets out pragmatic insurance requirements. It also recommends that tenders are evaluated using the most economically advantageous tender, or MEET methodology, which balances quality with price. The guidance encourages consortia to come together and bid collaboratively. Finally, the circular requires procurers to electronically publish tenders for spends in excess of 25,000 on the national electronic tendering platform eTenders and to record the outcome of the tender. The OGP is leading on procurement policy development in a number of other relevant areas, including such as the Social Clauses Project Group, the transposition process for the 3 new procurement directives, and a number of developments in relation to construction procurement policy, including the review of the public works contracts. The OGP supports the work of Enterprise Ireland and Intertrade Ireland in building awareness of public procurement and delivering training for small suppliers in bidding for public contracts. In particular, the OGP supports the Meet the Buyer events, which help suppliers meet public sector buyers to better understand how public procurement works and the relevance of their goods and services. Intertrade Ireland data shows that attendees submit more tenders afterwards. The events this year are being held in Belfast, which is on tomorrow, and in City West on the 12th of November. I would strongly encourage any deputies that would be available to come along to the events and see the engagement with the SME community. This year, the OGP has attended a number of other business events, such as Taking Care of Business and the National Ploughing Championships. At these events, the OGP focused on helping businesses understand how easy it is to register on the national tendering platform eTenders and to receive alerts regarding business opportunities. The OGP also supports the state's subsidised Go to Tender programme for small businesses run by Intertrade and a new programme on consortia building. Finally, the Competition Authority, as mentioned earlier, is currently developing guidance material for SMEs who are considering establishing consortia to bid for state contracts. In relation to data, there continues to be wide-ranging data quoted regarding procurement spend. I'd like to advise the committee what the OGP is doing in relation to bringing about better data on procurement. There are thousands of state bodies spending money, the larger of whom have IT systems for processing spend, the smaller of whom are probably using spreadsheets and even paper to record spend information. The state has had no mechanism in the past for collecting data on the amount of monies spent across the public service on goods and services. It has not been possible to determine in detail how much is spent, with whom, on what, and at what price. In autumn of 2013, the OGP initiated a project to begin collecting the spend information from larger sectors which account for over 80% of the state spend on goods and services. To date, the OGP has collected approximately 53% of the state spend in one database. The project is moving on to a second phase which will include central government. For the first time, this will allow the OGP in the coming months to publish far more accurate estimates of spend. So in summary, good public procurement is key to delivering sustainable value for money for the taxpayer. The new centralised structures for procurement are at an early stage, but offer a significant opportunity to deliver better value for money, consistent implementation of policy, reduce risk for the state, and improve data provision. A key focus is to sustain competition in markets, and to work with other state bodies to fully support and encourage smaller businesses in competing for government business. The information I've provided today demonstrates, I believe, that the OGP has been proactively working with all stakeholders in identifying issues of concern for SMEs and effectively dealing with those issues to the betterment of the procurement landscape in Ireland. These reforms are fundamental in their nature and will take time to implement and bed in. As Chief Procurement Officer, I am clear that we must listen to and be open to our stakeholders and industry in delivering for government what is a complex and challenging agenda. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Deputy Tobin.
I suppose just one of the piece of information that I've heard there that really strikes me is that the government hasn't to date fully collected information on relation to state spend, and any enterprise looking in, will to imagine that we haven't been collecting this information to date is quite shocking. You can't manage if you can't measure. And also, just from my own perspective and from working with small businesses, it's clear that the procurement system in this country is a disaster from their perspective. And I'm glad to see that there are moves afoot to change that in some way. One of the great debates that has been had in this committee over the last period of time is how much money is leaked from this state with regards to state procurement. If we have roughly 8.5 billion, we've heard estimates of 28%, 27%, 22%, some saying 15% on an island basis, others saying 5%. That's a key piece of information because it determines then policy by the state. And then, if you could give us an example of the average size of tenders over the last number of years, in the last 3 years, just to see what trend has been, because obviously there's an argument over the bundling and the unbundling of tenders to make them accessible to smaller businesses as well. My understanding is that you mentioned Bantry and Berlin, where we tend towards the Berlin side more than other countries tend towards external businesses, and that's not a good thing. I think we need to fulfil our responsibilities within the law, but we also need to promote Irish businesses. The issue of consortia is a really difficult issue for small businesses. Indeed, we had presentations here which indicated that there was no clear line of development with regards to consortia in their ability to access larger contracts. Indeed, many of them felt that they would be criminally liable if they entered the space where they could be identified as a cartel, and that line wasn't clear. Pre-qualification, we also heard very clearly that pre-qualification criteria were set oftentimes before the actual size of the contract was identified. So in other words, contracts that were supposed to be maybe of 100 million had a pre-qualification set, and then the initial tender went out for 16 million with that inflated pre-qualification criteria. Also, I've in my work have come across the experience where contractors, due to the cost issue, start to buy tenders. So in other words, they pitch for a tender below what's the reasonable delivery of the cost, and then they squeeze either a subcontractor along the supply chain or workers along the supply chain. And we see in the Kishog site at the moment where workers are on strike because many of them getting a wage of less than €5 an hour there as well. The issue of economic cost, which you identify as part of the new policy change, will that economic cost include taxes foregone by the state due to the closure of a business or people being made unemployed? And will it also include welfare costs due to the jobs lost to the state? And what other costs will it include? So maybe if we can tackle those questions.
Mr. Quinn.
Thank you, Deputy. There's a lot in that. In relation to the first point, yes, you asked a question with regard to data and data availability. I think we as a state are fundamentally well behind other jurisdictions who have typically been working of the order of 8 to 10 years in collecting data. So we are trying to catch up, is how I would put it, in relation to capture data and being in a position to answer for the Oireachtas and for from a procurement perspective as well, and for the general public, how the money in the state is spent. And I think that leads on to your question with regard to the how much money is spent outside of the state. I think it comes back to what I said earlier in relation to just the amount of systems we have. There are thousands of public sector bodies out there, public bodies that spend money on behalf of the state. We haven't traditionally had a system in place to gather that information. We now have that system in place, and we've been focusing in on the larger public sector bodies to provide us data, which they have started to do, and that's why we have. The good news is we're starting to get that data in, and it's starting to give us the granularity and visibility of where the taxpayer money is spent. As we go towards the latter part of the year, it would be our intention to publish information from that database, so that we're being open and transparent in relation to where the public spends its money. With regard to, you asked the question of, is it 28%? The short answer in relation to that is we have multiple different answers based upon which data set that one looks at, which is not an acceptable answer from my perspective. The last set of data which we provided publicly was related to 2011 data. It's important to understand the context of that data in that the government advertises its opportunities on the e-tenders website. Where the opportunity itself breaches certain thresholds, the spend also needs to be advertised on the EU journal. So, for example, in the context of works, that's a little bit over 5 million. In the context of goods and services by central government departments, it's 134,000. For other public bodies, it's 270,000, and in utilities, it's 400,000. But once you go beyond those thresholds, there is a requirement on public sector bodies to publish not only locally but also in the EU. The data is gathered in relation to the outcome of those processes. Typically, it takes quite some time to gather that data because some of those contracts are really large. The opportunities could be very big, and the processes could take quite some time to work through. And that's why you hear data that sounds like it is years old. It's because sometimes those processes take quite some time. In relation to the 2011 data, for the spend that was in excess of the threshold, 240 million was awarded to businesses that are not within the state. 240 million out of our total public procurement spend, which is somewhere between 12 and 13 billion in total. So that would indicate somewhere of the order of 5%. Whereas if you look at it simply as a subset of the competitions that went to market, you come up with a different number.
Can I just?
And that, sorry.
Sorry, can I just come in the point? At the start, you mentioned that there was 8.5 billion of public expenditure, and then you said there was 5 billion was in the remit of public procurement, I understand. But you've given a 12 to 13 billion euro figure there.
Yeah, just to help clarify that, Deputy, we have, at this moment in time, the state spends approximately 8.5 billion on goods and services. What that excludes is approximately 3.4 billion of capital works. So large projects such as the Lewis Interconnector, etc., that would also be part of it. So when you add those numbers up, you come to a number between 12 to 13 billion. And again, this points